Have you ever noticed how the most profound transformations occur in silence, when the world falls away and you stand alone with nothing but your thoughts echoing in the emptiness? There's a particular kind of woman who understands this sacred solitude, not as abandonment but as invitation. She's the one who walks through the fire of isolation and emerges not broken but luminous. While others frantically collect connections like currency, she's discovered the hidden wealth of her own company. This is not a story of loneliness, but of sovereignty, not of absence, but of presence so complete it requires no witnesses. The woman who thrives without friends isn't missing something. She's found what others are still searching for. If this resonates with your journey, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of independent spirits. In the quietest moments, we hear the loudest truths about ourselves. The modern world has trained you to fear silence, to fill every moment with noise, connection, distraction, anything to avoid that still, small space where you must finally face yourself. But what if the very silence you've been running from is actually the crucible where your authentic self is waiting to be born? Consider the difference between a crowded room and an empty one. In crowds, you perform, you adjust your words, modulate your laughter, monitor your appearance, all to maintain your place in the delicate web of social acceptance. But in that empty room, who are you when no one is watching? When no applause follows your actions, when no validation arrives to confirm your worth? This is precisely where the woman who thrives alone makes her most important discovery. In that stillness, she unveils layers of herself that social dynamics would never permit to surface, parts too intense, too honest, too uncompromising for casual company. These are the fragments of authenticity that get polished away in the constant friction of pleasing others. Think of Kaya in her mountain solitude. Each morning she wakes to silence so complete she can hear her own heartbeat. No messages waiting, no opinions to consider, no feedback loop of external validation. At first, this vacuum feels like punishment, the absence of everything familiar and comforting, but gradually something shifts. The voice in her head, once a chaotic chorus of others' expectations, clarifies into something singular and true, her own voice. Perhaps for the first time, the silence becomes not emptiness but fullness, not isolation but communion with her deepest self. Have you noticed how uncomfortable people become in prolonged silence? Watch them reach for phones, turn on music, fill the air with nervous chatter. This discomfort isn't random. It's the unconscious recognition that silence demands authenticity, and authenticity requires courage. When a woman embraces this silence rather than fleeing from it, she enters the forge where her strongest parts will be tempered. Here, without the cushion of external approval, she must learn to stand on the foundation of her own worth, to wake up each day and choose herself again and again, not because others validate that choice, but because she recognizes her inherent value. This is not selfishness, it's self-responsibility, the understanding that no one can provide what you must cultivate within. No friendship, no matter how deep, can substitute for this essential contract with yourself. The woman who masters silence doesn't fear being alone with her thoughts. She's excavated the darkest corners of her mind, faced the shadows most people spend lifetimes avoiding, and emerged with a kind of strength that doesn't require witnesses to exist. Like a tree growing in a remote forest, her growth continues whether or not anyone sees it. Are you willing to enter this silence? To sit with yourself long enough to hear past the initial discomfort into the deeper wisdom waiting there? Can you resist the urge to distract yourself from your own company? Because the truth is this: until you can be fully present with yourself, you cannot be fully present with anyone else. The quality of your connections will never exceed the quality of your relationship with yourself. And that relationship can only deepen in the sacred forge of silence. 1,000 shallow streams cannot quench the thirst that one deep well satisfies. There's a particular pain in realizing that what you thought was connection was merely its shadow, like mistaking a mirage for water in the desert. The disappointment cuts deeper because of how desperately you needed it to be real. Think about those friendships that seem so solid in easier seasons. The people who were always there for celebrations, for casual coffee dates, for light-hearted texts and comfortable conversations that never ventured below the surface. They created the comfortable illusion of belonging, of being seen, until life demanded more, until you lost your job, until your health faltered, until your relationship ended, until your beliefs shifted in ways that made others uncomfortable, until you needed not just company, but companionship, not just presence, but witness, not just words, but understanding. And suddenly, the crowd thinned. Messages went unanswered. Invitations dwindled. The very people who claimed to know you best revealed that perhaps they didn't know you at all, or worse, knew but couldn't handle the fullness of who you are. This unveiling is both devastation and liberation. The pain of discovering that connections you invested in were based on convenience rather than commitment, but also the freedom of no longer maintaining friendships that required you to be less than your complete self. Consider Kaya again. Before her mountain solitude, she had what appeared to be a vibrant social circle. She was the friend who organized gatherings, remembered birthdays, listened to problems, offered support. She believed these efforts were building a community that would hold her when she needed holding. But when public betrayal left her vulnerable, these same friends scattered like leaves in wind. Some took sides against her, others simply disappeared. A few offered shallow platitudes from a safe distance. None stood firmly beside her in the storm. This revelation might have broken her. Instead, it broke something in her, the fragile belief that her worth was tied to how many people chose to stay, the desperate need to be liked that had shaped so many of her choices, the fear of being alone that had kept her accepting less than she deserved. How many of your own relationships exist primarily because you fear solitude? How many compromises in authenticity have you made to maintain connections that still leave you feeling unseen? What parts of yourself do you carefully hide to remain acceptable? The woman who thrives without friends has asked these questions and faced their uncomfortable answers. She's recognized that many social bonds are built on mutual need rather than mutual growth, on shared activities rather than shared values, on the comfortable exchange of presence without the challenging gift of truth. This recognition doesn't make her cynical, it makes her discerning. It calibrates her internal compass to detect the difference between genuine connection and its convincing counterfeit, between people who want her for what she provides and those rare few who want her for who she is. In the absence of these superficial ties, she discovers something revolutionary, that the energy once spent maintaining these hollow connections can now be directed inward, that the hours once filled with surface-level socializing can be invested in pursuits that genuinely resonate with her soul, that the emotional labor of managing others' perceptions can be redirected toward her own growth. And perhaps most importantly, she learns that being temporarily alone is infinitely preferable to being permanently misunderstood. That solitude, however challenging, offers a clarity that compromised connections never could. Are you brave enough to examine your own circle with this level of honesty, to ask which relationships truly see and honor your authentic self, to consider what you might gain by releasing connections that require you to be less than you are? Because the woman who thrives without friends knows this secret. True connection cannot exist without true self-knowledge. And sometimes, the path to finding your people begins with the courage to walk alone. The applause of others fades with the setting sun. The truth you speak to yourself echoes into eternity. Imagine living entirely from the inside out, making choices not based on anticipated reactions, but on internal alignment, speaking words that reflect your truth rather than what will be well received, moving through the world not as a collection of others' expectations, but as a singular, authentic force. This is the quiet revolution that occurs when a woman learns to validate herself. Society trains women particularly in the art of external validation. From earliest childhood, the message arrives: your worth is in others' eyes, your beauty is in their gaze, your value is in their approval, your voice matters when they listen, your ideas matter when they agree. You exist most fully when witnessed by others. But what happens when that witness is removed? When there is no audience to perform for, no feedback loop of praise or critique, no external measure of success or failure? For most, this absence creates panic, a disorienting loss of identity. But for the woman who chooses to thrive alone, it becomes the doorway to liberation. Without external voices to drown out her own, she begins the sacred practice of self-validation. Return to Kaya on her mountain. At first, accomplishments feel hollow without someone to share them with. The magnificent sunset seems somehow less vibrant without another's gasp of appreciation. The personal breakthrough feels unfinished without another's understanding nod. But gradually something shifts. She begins to fully inhabit her own experience, to be both the doer and the witness, to create for the pure joy of creation, to grow for the satisfaction of evolution, to heal not for others' approval of her wholeness, but for the quiet peace it brings her soul. This is the profound alchemy that occurs in solitude, the transformation from seeking external approval to creating internal alignment, from asking, "What will they think?" to "What feels true?" From living as a reflection in others' eyes to becoming the author of your own meaning. Have you felt the exhaustion of constant external validation? The way it depletes you to constantly scan for feedback, adjust your course, shape yourself to fit expectations. The endless anxiety of wondering if you're enough, pretty enough, smart enough, successful enough, likable enough, in a world that profits from your self-doubt. The woman who validates herself steps off this endless treadmill, not into arrogance or disconnection, but into a grounded sovereignty. She still values thoughtful feedback. She still cherishes genuine connection, but these no longer form the foundation of her worth. They become conversations between equals rather than lifelines to her self-esteem. This internal validation creates an unshakable center. Criticism may still sting, but it no longer devastates. Praise may still warm, but it no longer defines. Rejection may still disappoint, but it no longer destroys, because she has cultivated the habit of turning inward for her primary compass reading, of checking her own truth before consulting another's map. When you learn to validate yourself, you develop an authenticity that paradoxically makes genuine connection more possible, not less. You no longer approach relationships from lack, but from fullness, not seeking others to complete you, but to complement what is already whole, not desperate for approval, but open to resonance. The woman who thrives without friends carries this powerful truth: your worth exists independent of external acknowledgement. Like gravity, it operates whether or not you believe in it, whether or not others recognize it. Your task is not to earn worth, but to remember it. Not to seek validation, but to return to the validation that has always existed at your core. Can you begin this practice of self-validation? Can you catch yourself in the act of seeking external approval and gently turn that question inward? Instead, can you become both the seeker and the answer? Because the revolution of self-validation changes everything. It transforms relationships from necessities to choices. It converts loneliness from punishment to opportunity. And it returns to you the power that you've always held, but perhaps forgotten, to be the primary author of your own story. What seems like absence is actually potential. What looks like emptiness is the canvas awaiting your masterpiece. There's a fundamental difference between being alone and being lonely, a distinction that society often blurs. Loneliness is the painful awareness of unwanted separation. Solitude is the spacious experience of purposeful aloneness. One depletes, the other nourishes. One feels like abandonment, the other like coming home. The empty room that most people avoid becomes, for the woman who thrives alone, a sacred space of unlimited potential. Consider what happens in emptiness. Seeds germinate in dark soil before reaching toward light. Stars form in the vast emptiness of space. Creative inspiration often arrives in moments of quiet reflection. The most profound transformations often occur not in the noise of community, but in the fertile void of solitude. This is the paradox that Kaya discovers in her year of isolation. What appears from the outside as empty space, devoid of social interaction, stripped of external structure, absent of others' input, gradually reveals itself as the most generative environment she has ever inhabited. Like a fallow field that looks barren but is actually rebuilding nutrients essential for future growth, her solitude is not empty, but replenishing. In this sacred space, three transformations unfold that would be impossible in the constant presence of others. First comes the unmasking. In solitude, the social personas you've crafted, the perfect friend, the competent professional, the supportive partner, the agreeable companion, fall away. Without an audience, these characters have no purpose. What remains is more raw, more authentic, and sometimes more uncomfortable. Parts of yourself you've carefully hidden, both shadow and light, rise to the surface. Confronting these aspects requires courage, but integration of these fragmented pieces is what makes wholeness possible. Have you noticed how differently you behave when absolutely no one is watching? How your face relaxes, your body language shifts, your thoughts flow in directions that might surprise others who think they know you. This is not deception, it's the revelation of layers you may not even reveal to yourself in company. The second transformation is reclamation. In the absence of external demands, you begin to recognize desires that may have been buried under obligations, interests you abandoned to make room for others' priorities, dreams you set aside to pursue more practical or acceptable paths, beliefs you modified to maintain harmony. The sacred space of solitude allows you to reclaim these essential pieces, to sort through what you've accumulated and distinguish between what truly resonates and what you've carried out of habit or expectation. Kaya discovers that without friends constantly reflecting back an image of who they think she is, she's free to evolve beyond those limitations. She rediscovers childhood passions. She explores ideas that would have been dismissed in her former circles. She reconnects with parts of her heritage she had downplayed to fit in. She becomes not less but more herself. expanded rather than diminished by the absence of social reinforcement. The third transformation is perhaps the most profound: reconstruction. With clear understanding of your authentic self and reclamation of your true desires, you can begin to build a life that actually fits who you are, not who you've been expected to be. This reconstruction happens from the inside out, beginning with values and extending to daily choices, relationships, work, and purpose. The woman who thrives without friends uses solitude as the architect's tape, where she redesigns her life according to her own blueprint, not one handed to her by family, culture, or social circles. She learns to distinguish between her own voice and the internalized voices of others. She practices making choices based on internal resonance rather than external approval. This sacred space of solitude teaches her that the opposite of loneliness isn't company, it's connection. Connection with herself first, which then becomes the foundation for authentic connection with others, not from need or fear or habit, but from genuine resonance and mutual recognition. Can you begin to view your own periods of solitude not as punishment, but as opportunity? Can you enter the empty room not with dread, but with curiosity? Can you trust that what feels like absence might actually be the presence of your most essential self, waiting to be recognized? Because the woman who thrives without friends knows that the empty room is never truly empty. It is filled with potential, with truth, with the sacred presence of her own becoming. It is not the absence of others that defines this space, but the fullness of her own presence within it. The easy path welcomes many travelers. The true path tests your willingness to walk it alone. There's a particular temptation that arrives in seasons of solitude, the urge to settle for connections that don't truly honor your worth, like a parched traveler in the desert, willing to drink from muddy water rather than continue. Searching for a clean spring, the ache of loneliness can make compromise seem reasonable, necessary. This is where the woman who thrives alone reveals her most uncommon strength, the courage to maintain her standards even when it means continued solitude, the wisdom to recognize that not all company is equal, the self-respect to understand that some forms of connection deplete rather than nourish, the patience to wait for what resonates rather than grasping at what's merely available. Think of how society frames female friendships as essential, life-giving, non-negotiable parts of a woman's identity and support system. Find your tribe, they say. You need your girlfriends. No woman is an island. These messages, however, well-intentioned, create both pressure and fear. The pressure to form connections regardless of their quality. The fear that without these connections, something is fundamentally wrong with you. Kaya feels this pressure acutely during her year of solitude. Each day brings the temptation to reach out, to rebuild her social circle, to end the discomfort of being alone. Former friends who had abandoned her during her crisis occasionally resurface, offering cautious invitations. New acquaintances appear, curious about the woman who seems complete within herself. The opportunity to end her isolation presents itself repeatedly, but something has shifted in her. She's developed a new kind of clarity, the ability to distinguish between connections that would enhance her authentic self and those that would require her to diminish it, between relationships based on mutual growth and those built on mutual distraction, between people who would witness her evolution and those who would subtly work to prevent it. This clarity becomes her compass, pointing unfailingly toward her own integrity, even when the path it indicates looks lonely, even when every cultural message tells her that any friendship is better than none, even when well-meaning voices suggest she's being too selective, too cautious, too unwilling to compromise. Have you felt this pressure? The subtle and not so subtle messages that there must be something wrong with you if you haven't found your people. The implication that being selective about your connections indicates pride or fear rather than discernment. The assumption that solitude equals loneliness rather than choice. The woman who thrives without friends recognizes these as outdated stories, narratives that serve social cohesion but not necessarily individual growth. She understands that there is profound strength in being willing to stand alone rather than contort herself to fit where she doesn't truly belong. This doesn't mean she closes herself to connection. Rather, it means she approaches potential relationships with both openness and discernment, willing to extend herself but unwilling to abandon herself in the process. She's learned that the quality of her connections matters far more than their quantity, that one relationship built on mutual authenticity provides more nourishment than a dozen based on convenience or surface compatibility. Most importantly, she's discovered that her willingness to stand alone actually becomes her greatest strength within relationships. Because she doesn't need others to feel complete, she can love without clinging. Because she doesn't fear solitude, she can set boundaries without anxiety. Because she knows her own worth, she can recognize and honor the worth in others without competition or comparison. This is the paradox that few understand. The woman most capable of profound connection is the one who doesn't require it to feel whole. The woman most worthy of friendship is the one who has learned to be her own best friend first. Can you recognize the difference between compromise and settling, between reasonable flexibility and abandonment of your standards? Can you trust that your willingness to stand alone might actually be preparing you for connections of a quality you haven't yet experienced? Because the strength to stand alone isn't about isolation. It's about integrity, not about rejection of others, but about such complete acceptance of yourself that you no longer need to accept less than you deserve. True strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It simply stands, and the world reorganizes around it. There's a curious phenomenon that occurs when a woman becomes complete within herself. When she no longer approaches relationships from a place of lack or need, when she has done the interior work of becoming whole, she develops a particular kind of presence, an authentic power that seems to emanate from her very being, invisible but palpable. And this wholeness becomes a magnetic force, drawing toward her precisely what she no longer desperately seeks. Consider what happens when you stop chasing after connection and instead focus on cultivating your own depth. When you redirect the energy once spent trying to belong externally toward the more essential work of belonging to yourself, a shift occurs. Not just in how you see the world, but in how the world sees you. The quality of people drawn to you transforms, no longer attracted to what you can provide or how you make them feel, but to the authentic resonance between your truth and theirs. No longer seeking someone to complete them or distract them or validate them, but someone who walks beside them in mutual recognition and respect. When Kaya finally emerges from her mountain solitude, she doesn't announce her transformation. She doesn't seek to reclaim her former social position. She doesn't try to prove anything to those who doubted her. She simply re-enters the world carrying a presence so grounded, so authentic, that others immediately sense the shift. Former friends approach cautiously, unsure of this new Kaya, who seems both familiar and utterly changed. Some are intrigued by her quiet confidence. Others are threatened by it. A few recognize in her something they've been seeking in themselves, the courage to be fully present, fully authentic, fully alive. But most significantly, she begins to attract people she would never have connected with before. People whose own journeys have taught them similar lessons about integrity and authenticity. People who value depth over display, growth over comfort, truth over harmony. People who don't need her to be anything other than exactly who she is. This is the natural law that operates in human connection. Like attracts like, not in superficial traits or shared interests, but in level of consciousness, in willingness to be authentic, in capacity for presence, in comfort with both light and shadow aspects of being human. The woman who has learned to thrive without friends doesn't fear this law, she embodies it. She understands that her willingness to do her own interior work naturally attracts others who have done theirs, that her comfort with solitude naturally draws those who don't use relationships as escape, that her self-validation naturally connects her with those secure enough to celebrate rather than compete. Have you noticed this pattern in your own life? How in seasons where you're most desperate for connection, the people drawn to you often mirror your own insecurities. How in periods when you're most centered in yourself, the quality of your interactions naturally elevates. How relationships formed from wholeness rather than need have a different texture, a different trajectory, a different truth. The magnetic power of wholeness operates whether or not you consciously wield it. It's not a technique or a strategy. It's a natural consequence of the internal work, of choosing authenticity over approval, of cultivating presence over performance, of committing to growth over comfort. This magnetism doesn't guarantee a large circle of friends. In fact, it often results in fewer but deeper connections. Relationships, based not on circumstance or convenience, but on genuine resonance, not on who you pretend to be, but on who you actually are. And perhaps most liberating of all, this natural law means you no longer need to chase after connection or convince others of your worth. You no longer need to perform or perfect or please. You simply need to continue the sacred work of becoming ever more fully yourself, and trust that those meant to walk alongside you will be drawn to the light of your authenticity. Can you release the effort of trying to belong and instead focus on the journey of becoming? Can you trust that As you cultivate your own depth, you naturally attract connections of matching depth. Can you believe that your wholeness rather than your need is what creates the strongest foundation for meaningful relationship? Because the woman who thrives without friends eventually discovers this truth. True connection isn't something you find, it's something you become ready for. And that readiness arises not from searching outside yourself, but from the sacred commitment to your own wholeness. The most enduring work often happens in shadow, unseen by any witness but time itself. There's a peculiar strength in working without witnesses, in continuing your growth even when no one is there to validate or appreciate it. Most people need the reinforcement of external recognition to sustain their efforts. They need the affirmation, the acknowledgement, the applause. Without these, their motivation falters, their dedication wanes. But the woman who thrives alone understands something profound about legacy, that the most important work often happens in silence, unmarked by public recognition, but no less powerful in its impact. That transformation, once embodied, radiates outward whether or not its source is identified. That personal evolution creates ripples that continue long after the initial stone has disappeared beneath the surface. Consider what Kaya couldn't possibly know during her year of solitude, how her internal transformation would eventually affect everyone she encountered, how the strength she forged in silence would become a reference point for others facing their own crucibles, how her refusal to settle for hollow connections would create space for authentic ones to emerge, how her journey, though solitary, would ultimately create a map others could follow. This is the silent legacy of the woman who does her work without witnesses, who continues showing up for her own growth even when no one else sees it or celebrates it, who understands that personal evolution isn't just about individual fulfillment, but about elevating the collective consciousness, who recognizes that the qualities she cultivates within herself, integrity, authenticity, courage, compassion, become available to everyone she touches, whether or not they know the source. Have you considered how your own internal work might be creating legacy even now? How the patterns you break within yourself help break them for future generations? How the self-respect you cultivate changes what others believe is possible? How your willingness to stand in your truth creates permission for others to find theirs. The woman who thrives without friends doesn't need immediate recognition to sustain her efforts. She's playing a longer game, one measured not in social media metrics or superficial achievements, but in the depth and authenticity of her impact. She understands that true influence emerges not from visibility, but from integrity, not from volume, but from depth, not from performance, but from presence. This understanding liberates her from the exhausting pursuit of external validation. She no longer needs to announce her growth or receive approval for her choices. She simply continues the sacred work of becoming, trusting that embodied transformation speaks louder than any declaration, that who she is resonates more powerfully than what she says, that how she lives creates more lasting impact than what she achieves. And perhaps most importantly, she recognizes that her legacy extends beyond what she can see in her lifetime, that the young woman watching her from afar might find courage from her example decades later, that the child who witnesses her standing in her truth might grow up understanding that authenticity is possible, that future generations might inherit new possibilities because she was willing to break old patterns. This is the profound power of doing your work even when alone, of continuing your growth even without witnesses, not because it brings immediate reward, but because it changes what's possible for everyone who comes after you, not because it guarantees success, but because it transforms what success means. Can you release the need for immediate recognition and instead focus on the quality of your presence? Can you trust that your internal work creates external impact, whether or not it's publicly celebrated? Can you believe that your willingness to grow, even in solitude, leaves footprints others will follow? Because the woman who thrives without friends understands this ultimate truth. We never know the full impact of our authentic presence. We never see all the lives touched, all the possibilities created, all the liberations sparked. We simply do our work, embody our truth, and trust that, like all energy, transformation can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed and transmitted forward. What would change if you fully embraced your own company? If you stopped seeing solitude as something to be avoided and began recognizing it as the sacred ground where your most authentic self emerges? What parts of you might finally have space to breathe? Consider what you've compromised to maintain connections that never quite resonated with your truth, the interests you've downplayed, the dreams you've kept quiet, the boundaries you've allowed to be crossed, the intuitions you've ignored. What would it mean to reclaim these essential parts? Ask yourself, whose validation am I still seeking? Whose approval still holds power over my choices? Whose disapproval do I still fear? What would become possible if I learned to validate myself with the same commitment I've shown to validating others? What if the empty room isn't empty at all, but filled with possibilities you haven't yet recognized? What if your current solitude isn't punishment but preparation, not isolation, but invitation to a depth of self-knowledge that will transform every future connection? Could it be that in learning to thrive without friends, you're actually learning how to be the kind of friend to yourself and eventually to others that changes what friendship means, that elevates it from convenience to commitment, from distraction to growth, from hollow to whole? Is it possible that your willingness to stand alone now is precisely what will attract the authentic connections you've always sought? That your courage to maintain standards even in lonely seasons is creating space for relationships that actually honor your worth? What legacy might you be creating even now in the quiet work of becoming yourself? What invisible footprints are you leaving for others who will walk this path after you? What possibilities are you opening simply by refusing to settle for less than you deserve? The journey of thriving without friends isn't about rejecting connection. It's about transforming your relationship with it, about moving from dependency to choice, from external validation to internal compass, from quantity to quality, from fear-based attachment to love-based authenticity. This path asks much of you. It demands that you face yourself honestly, embrace your shadows compassionately, and claim your light unapologetically. It requires the courage to stand alone when necessary and the wisdom to recognize genuine resonance when it appears. But what awaits on the other side of this journey is a kind of freedom few experience, the freedom to be completely yourself, to connect from wholeness rather than lack, to love without fear, to stand in your truth without apology, to create legacy through integrity rather than visibility. If you find yourself walking this path, whether by choice or circumstance, know that you're not truly alone. Countless women before you have discovered the strength that emerges in solitude, the clarity that arrives in silence, the power that develops when you finally choose yourself. Their invisible footprints mark the way forward. Their silent legacy empowers your journey. Their transformed consciousness creates space for yours to expand. This is your invitation to join their lineage, to become the kind of woman whose authentic presence changes rooms, whose quiet strength inspires others to find their own, whose willingness to do the interior work transforms not just her life, but the lives of all she touches. See you next time. Keep your eyes open, your mind curious, and your spirit evolving.